Jesus Christ.
I'd like to make a connection with today's readings of the Gospel, actually our continuous reading of the Gospel, which kind of anticipates how the conception of Jesus took place, how the birth, how the journey of Mary with her family unfolded. So we have been reading the whole story of Christmas this week as if an anticipation. I'd like to make a connection of this anticipated reading and the very substantial thoughts from Pope Francis on suffering and faith. In one of these days I had a very interesting dream. In my dream I looked through my window from here in the vicarage, and instead of the usual familiar landscape, I saw a totally different street, back from the country where my mother lives. And I was surprised that I'm looking through this window and I can see a totally different traffic. There were cars going on, people were walking, there were trees, the familiar scene from my mother's window. And it was surprising. And then the dream continued that I wanted to tell people that, hey, it's very weird, it's interesting. So in my dream there were people in that room, and I went to them. I wanted to tell them that, look, it's not the scene. But whenever I went to a people or a person, it felt like a black and white film. So I wanted to tell them that, hey, can you listen to me? I'm saying something, that the view is weird. And my hands went through an empty kind of space as a film. I realized that whatever I'm doing, they can't hear me. And I complained that, cannot you hear me? So it was a very interesting dream. I'm sure that there are many funny translations or interesting interpretations of it. I'm going to ask my psychoanalyst friends. But the thought came to me that when we read the Gospel, the Christmas story before Christmas, we are surprised that why are we reading this? We are going to celebrate it in few days' time. And it's a bit like this time lag or time delay in my dream, what I see and to whom I'm talking to and where I am actually. So there's a gap between them. And this gap is an important warning that we want to be there as Jesus wants us to be. We want to enjoy that peace and integrity in our life which God intends us to do, but somehow like I'm in the dream that, hey, cannot you hear me? Things are not there where they should be. But we have to be patient till God merges these two. And the connection, I like to make the connection with a very, very challenging paragraph, actually Article 56 from Pope Francis's encyclical letter, The Light of Faith, which is about the relationship between faith and suffering. And in particular what the Pope says that even in the end, what the Pope says that even amidst our sufferings, there is always a chance to go. And the Pope is going to touch upon the most difficult topic, death, when someone is dying, and the Pope calls it as the ultimate go forth from your land, the ultimate come spoken by the Father, just as he spoke to Jesus. And my first thought was that if someone hears it who is in the midst of suffering or aging and on the verge of dying soon, it might sound as an over-spiritualization of the situation. But no, if we use this analogy that there is a time gap between where we should be in our understanding and when we are now, and that gap will be undone merged by God, that's the moment of our faith. So let us read what the Pope says. Consolation and strength amid suffering. I'm sorry if today's homily is slightly longer, but it's so important. Writing to the Corinthians about his suffering, St. Paul links his faith to his preaching of the gospel. In himself he sees fulfilled the passage of Scripture which says, "I believed and so I spoke." 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 13. The reference is to a verse of Psalm 115 in which the psalmist exclaims, "I kept my faith even when I said, I am greatly afflicted." Verse 10. I kept my faith even when I said, I am greatly afflicted. To speak of faith often involves speaking of painful testing. Yet, it is precisely in such testing that Paul sees the most convincing proclamation of the gospel, for it is in weakness and suffering that we discover God's power, which triumphs over our weakness and suffering. So it is in weakness and suffering that we discover God's power, which triumphs over our weakness and suffering. And it is from here when the Pope's saying gets more and more serious. The Apostle himself experienced a dying which would become life for Christians. In the hour of trial, faith brings light, while suffering and weakness make it evident that we do not proclaim ourselves, we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 5. The 11th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews concludes with a reference to those who suffered for their faith. Hebrews chapter 11 verses 35 to 38. Outstanding among these was Moses, who suffered abuse for the Christ. And this is what I'd like to highlight, what the Pope says, the closing sentences of Article 56. Christians know that suffering cannot be eliminated. Yet, it can have meaning and become an act of love and entrustment into the hands of God, who does not abandon us. In this way, it can serve as a moment of growth in faith and love. By contemplating Christ's union with the Father, even the height of his suffering on the cross, Christians learn to share in the same gaze of Jesus. And this is the challenging sentence. Even death is illumined and can be experienced as the ultimate call to faith, the ultimate "go forth from your land." Genesis chapter 12 verse 1. The ultimate "go forth from your land." The ultimate "come," spoken by the Father, to whom we abandon ourselves in the confidence that he will keep us steadfast even in our final passage. Many of our sisters and brothers are dying today. This is the frame of our life. But let us read this passage, particularly this challenging second part, not as something over-spiritualizing a situation, giving a spiritual meaning to death, but as it happens as a support to us. Just like with the Christmas story, we read it now in full, and we are going to experience it in full on Christmas Eve. There is a gap between them. Let us ask for faith to narrow that gap between our present approach to our ultimate going forward from this land, when we are going to die and enter the Father's house.